I often hear people make the argument that Western values supposedly are the result of Christianity, that they basically inherit Christian values. The idea, for example, of individualism, or the idea of human rights, the inalienable human rights that we all supposedly have, or even the idea of the distinction between state and church, or the distinction between the private and the public sphere, which are pretty recent. The idea of the private deserving protection from the public being its own sphere, and everybody having a right to privacy, a right to having a private space, which others cannot simply interrupt, is pretty young, but supposedly also the result of Christian thinking and Christian values. And I've honestly never found this to be particularly convincing because the argument actually breaks off exactly at the point where it would get interesting. It's simply stating that, well, if these are your values, those values are Christian, and you kind of have to, um, you have to subscribe to Christianity itself, and you have to give Christianity its due if you want, and admit that those values are coming from a specific tradition and from a specific narrative. And I've never felt this to be particularly convincing because, from a secular point of view, for me, this is generally not how traditions or narratives work. This is when we're saying that these values are coming from Christianity, to me, this sounds like we're saying babies come from babies, right? When asked about music and um, improvisation, Keith Jarrett once answered, improvisation has to come from some kind of experience. It has to be rooted in some kind of human experience. And if it isn't, uh, it would be basically like saying babies come from babies. This is not how it works. Musical improvisation, if it has some depth, comes from human experience and is grounded in human experience. And in a very analogous manner, I believe, the same thing is true of religious traditions of various kinds, including Christianity. Christianity, I believe, is not coming from Christianity. I don't even believe it's coming from Revelation. From a secular point of view, my conviction is that Christianity comes from human experience. It is a mirror image of how humans experience themselves, of what human beings at a specific point in time find to be relevant, and what human beings at a specific point in time understand about themselves and see about themselves, and thus express through narrative. Christianity is not something that is being pulled up from above, from something that is beyond human experience altogether, but Christianity is, if you want, a catalytic um, image of some of the most relevant experiences, or what John Vervaeke has been calling relevance realizations, that human beings were capable of, put into text and put into symbolic form. And look at how Christians would even agree with me about all the other traditions that are out there except for Christianity. So Christians would say, well, look, Buddhism doesn't come from Buddhism. Buddhism is the result of human experience plus time, plus cultural phenomena, plus our symbolic mind being able of telling stories. If you take all of those together, and a few more factors like fear and traditions, local customs, even everyday life worlds, and everyday beliefs and superstitions, if you mingle all of those together, but always including human experience, you will get to something like Buddhism. You don't need something external, you don't need an external force which would create Buddhism. It is the result of human experience plus time, right? And I think Christians would agree with me. For every other tradition except their own, every other tradition they would treat basically as literature, and this is what literature does, right? I mean, it's a condensed form of human experience, and always a temporal and limited frame, never the whole thing, Christians would agree about every other tradition, every other single text ever written by human beings, except for their own tradition, right? And from my vantage point, this exceptionalism is just not really comprehensible. I just don't understand it. I just would apply to all traditions. And the irony here is that once you do that, you don't invalidate all the traditions, including Christianity, but you do basically the opposite. You say that all the traditions, because they're the result of human experience plus wrestling with reality, all of the traditions have something to teach us about human experience, about what it's like to be human, right? So once you get rid of the exceptionalism, you open yourself up to the possibility that certain traditions point something out that others didn't see as clearly. Just take one example, which I believe from a present day perspective might even be plausible to certain Christians. Within Christianity, within mainstream Christianity, I don't think you have anything resembling the depth of um, experiential exploration that you find in Tantra, right? I wouldn't be aware of that. I mean, I know um, there are sub schools within Christianity which explore sexuality to a certain degree, but nothing that I could compare to the entire tantric tradition, right? And particularly from a present day perspective, where we don't necessarily see sexuality as something that is inherently evil or inherently sinful, I think to most of us it would be plausible that if you had to choose from whom to learn about polarity and how to establish polarity, if you had to choose between the tantric tradition and Christianity, I think it would be most obvious for most of us to choose Tantra, simply because it's obviously about that and it's obviously knowledgeable about that. It's knowledgeable about polarity and how to establish it and how to transform urges into transformational experiences. It's like like comparing two traditions that are obviously different in their ability to deal with the phenomenon, right? Where one of the traditions, you might even argue, has outright rejected to even face the phenomenon consciously and in any kind of depth that would be worth repeating today. And this is something you couldn't do from a purely Christian perspective. So if you treat all the other traditions as just literature and treat your own tradition as the only revealed, if you want, truth, you would not be able to learn from different traditions, because even the incentive to do so would be something that is itself an expression of treason against your own tradition. And this is my general take on this. When Christians argue that values like individualism are coming from Christianity, I would make the point, but Christianity doesn't come from Christianity, it comes from human experience. Plus, again, our narrative abilities, plus the science of the respective time in which the traditions became big. So they're always intermingled with many, many different factors. And this would explain how some good ideas and still valid ideas, like the idea of the individual being something different from objects, or the subject being different from objects, and deserving certain rights and protections that we usually don't assume are there for just mere objects. Certain distinctions like those stand the test of time, and I believe even in 1,000 years from now, they will still be valid descriptors of human experience. And not because they're coming from a certain tradition, which found them or figured them out, but because they are inherent features of human experience. And there are actually many different traditions which are capable to express those insights in different kind of language. This is the fascinating point if you do interreligious comparisons, is that oftentimes very similar ideas come in the form of different specific narratives which try to approach those ideas from different narratives and from different symbolic spaces. And this is something that you wouldn't be open to if you, again, from the start, made the, for me, incomprehensible assumption that only one tradition is revealed and all the other traditions out there are nothing but narratives plus human experience. If, again, on the other hand, you open yourself up to all traditions having inherent value and inherent wisdom, you can learn from all of them, you can take from all of them, while at the same time seeing the limitations of all of those narratives. Because those narratives were always bound up to local customs, local superstitions, the local life world of a different time where the self-understanding and identity of people was significantly different from what we take to be our present-day self-understanding or identity. Just, again, take the topic of sexuality. I think for very, very few people today, you could really make the case and really make the point that repression when dealing with sexuality is a good idea. That's just, we know this doesn't work. And we know it has severely bad consequences, which show themselves in very, very ugly ways. And that there are many reasonable forms of going through this in a way that so that it can be transformed from something that is driving you to something that is actually revealing, if you want, higher realities to you. So this is my general take, and I don't know where I'm exactly wrong about this because it seems pretty darn obvious. But on the other hand, again, I just hear it all the time, people making the point that Christianity basically invented the Western world, which is just, to me, it's just a bad argument, and I just don't understand the argument, because it would still have to clarify to me, like, well, okay, but where do those ideas come from? Can't we ask the question? Where do those ideas about, for example, the individual come from? And when you start asking the question, you soon will figure out, well, wait, those ideas were not unique to Christianity. You find the idea of the individual, for example, being something significantly different, or the subject being significantly different from objects or the physical world in pre-Christian Platonic traditions, like the idea of the one, for example, or the oneness of experience. The unity of experience is an idea that predates Christianity and actually predates it significantly. You find it in Buddhist traditions, you find it in Vedantic traditions. It's not something that's unique to Christianity, and you can do this with every single concept that you figure to be valuable. You can actually, the moment you dig a little bit and ask the question, is there something comparable to that in other traditions? You'll figure out, yes, there is. Foundational distinctions are there in all of those traditions that can be found. And then you kind of lose your argument. But the problem is then you totally lose all the validity with that, because from the start, you made your point to be, because it's our tradition and because our tradition is revealed, we have a valid point. Now, once this is fallen apart, you don't have any valid points anymore. Well, if you approach it from the other perspective and ask yourself, well, what are the experiences that your tradition has picked up that are still relevant today? You can maintain those, you can integrate those, as Wilber puts it. You can have those partial truths, even when the overall story that you're defending is starting to fall apart, because it might have punctual insights. And this is true of all the traditions that are surrounding us. And I guess this is something where people have to decide for themselves. Like, what do you find intuitively more plausible? Do you think that one tradition, it is plausible that one tradition is revealed and all the other traditions are nothing but inventions of the human mind? Or do you conceptualize the role of narrative in a very different form as something that is expressing human experience and teaching us something about human experience in very unique ways, and thus has inherent value, no matter the tradition, right? You have to choose, I guess, which you find more plausible, but you kind of can't have it both ways, because if we insist on the power of revelation, and revelation being the thing that actually gives us validity and gives us, if you want, truth, You can't at the same time emphasize the role of experience as being that which gives us validity and gives us truth. You can't have it both ways. You have to choose for yourself, what do you want? Do you want to understand human experience? Or do you want to have absolute truth, truth that is unchanneled, that is absolutely given? And I think we have different intuitions about that.